Today, I have a wonderful surprise for you, which is another cartoon by the infamous Impact 360 Institute. You might remember them for their clunky dialogue between absurdly benign fictional Christians and absurdly stupid fictional atheists in previous videos I've covered. But what this one lacks in painfully bad theatrics, it makes up for by getting right down to business and using common shortcuts to pretend it had deduced that Jesus must have been God. Yay?
How would you feel if someone said, "Hello, I am God"?
It'd be kind of weird, I guess. But the problem is that the words are so far removed from any conversation I'm likely to find myself in, I'd just be inventing the whole conversation and then describing how I'd respond to what I just made up. And that feels kind of pointless.
Throughout history, lots of people have claimed to be a god. But they lived in cultures that believed in lots of gods. And although these gods were more powerful than humans, they had limits.
Like, for example, that they couldn't violate their own holy natures? Or allow sin into their presences? Or forgive people without the shedding of blood? Yeah, I get it. Some gods have limits.
So, for example, when the Roman emperor claimed to be a god, it was not a big deal. But when Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be God, things were quite different. Because Jesus didn't say he was just one of many gods. His claim was much, much bigger than that. He had the audacity to identify himself as the one true God of the universe.
A king claiming to be a god is a lot more complicated than not a big deal because he was just one of the many limited gods, for a lot of reasons I won't go into here. And the difference between the claims of Jesus and Caesar is a lot more complicated than the fact that Jesus claimed to be the more powerful god. Now, I'm not saying this is an insubstantial difference, and sure, it might have made Jesus' claim more radical. But it's far from the only difference. No claim to divinity exists in a vacuum. It arises in and is affected by a lot of social factors. And if an emperor claimed to be God, it would have to be done carefully after building a cult of personality around himself. This is probably the case with Augustus, who had to establish his own imperial status after a series of civil wars. And his divine image was elaborately woven with the help of literature like the Aeneid, which mythified his family origins. So if it's more about charisma and a carefully cultivated image than simple kingship, couldn't a magnetic religious leader build up the same cult of personality and maybe get his followers to believe he was divine? And would it be shocking if he convinced a devoted following that he was a different, very special kind of god? Now yes, this claim would be audacious. But charismatic leaders tend to make audacious claims. This isn't surprising, and we should be very leery of any attempt at reducing complex phenomena to one simple take and then using it to make specific logical deductions.
You see, Jesus was a Jew, and the Jewish conception of God was absolutely unique, unlike that of any other culture. Jews firmly believed there is only one God, and He alone is the perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing, uncreated ruler of all things. He is without beginning or end, and He alone created and sustains the entire universe. He is without limits, and He has no competition.
Really? This idea was totally unique to Judaism. Right. Except maybe try taking 5 seconds to Google Zoroastrianism. Not only does it have most of, if not all of these traits, but it's widely understood that Judaism and Christianity borrowed it from them. The simple fact of the matter is that Judeo-Christianity does not have a monopoly on nearly as many ideas as its followers think it does. And by saying it does in such sweeping terms, this video is just pandering to people it assumes don't want to know better. Now I guess if you want to spend all your time just immersed in one religion, that's your choice. But then how can you claim to know it's unique when you've gone out of your way to avoid studying other religions?
So, when Jesus claimed all of this for Himself, It's no surprise that he ignited a firestorm of opposition. No one had ever done this before. In fact, for the Jews, the very idea of God taking the form of a man simply did not exist.
Yeah, especially not when Jacob wrestled with God, or 3 men appeared to Abraham and one of them was God, or several other times when it's at least ambiguous whether it was God or an angel appearing as a human. Nope. No way Jews could possibly have gotten their heads around the idea of God in human form. Look, this is another really obvious simplification, and it's one apologists go too far too often. Basically, the idea of God in the flesh, or maybe of the Messiah dying or whatever else it might be, had no precedent in Hebrew tradition, therefore Jesus could never have made it up, so, the only explanation for his claim was that he was actually God. Even at face value, this simplification is absurd, assuming both that traditional Judaism was static and that it was the only idea that could have possibly fit into the early Christian movement. But Judea at that time did not exist in a bubble. It would have been exposed to a lot of ideas that were crisscrossing the ancient Roman world, including the revolutionary philosophies of cult-like figures who were to one extent or the other rumored to have divine status. On top of it all, it was a hotbed of political turmoil, with tension brewing not only between insurrectionists and the Roman government, but within the Jewish religion. As dissatisfied, sometimes desperate populist movements were challenging the established priesthood, which was increasingly seen as elitist and out of touch, and the apocalyptic messages of charismatic traveling preachers were stirring up the rabble and threatening the religious status quo. So should we be shocked to see wildly unorthodox ideas arise in this environment? To see some of these loose cannon preachers gain a cult following and maybe make some unhinged claims? It's really not that weird. And I bet Christians could come up with perfectly natural explanations if we were talking about any other figure from any other culture. There's one final irony here, which is that whenever Jesus defies expectations of the Old Testament, he must be God because nobody could have made it up. But whenever he meets those expectations, he must be God because he's fulfilling prophecy. It's almost like Christians are going to find a way to deduce Jesus as God no matter what happens.
This concept is found nowhere in all of ancient Jewish literature. By claiming to be the God of the universe, Jesus created an identity crisis. Each of us must decide for ourselves, who was Jesus?
Okay, so how can a religion be so self-absorbed that it thinks its claims present everybody else in the world with an identity crisis? From the outside, the claim that Jesus was God looks like all the other weird that religions tend to claim, and most people are fine casually shrugging this kind of thing off and going about their business. So when Christians expect everybody to halt the moment someone asks them whether Jesus was God, as if this claim puts them at some life-defining crossroads, they're showing a remarkable inability to understand how outsiders see the religion. It's no wonder fundamentalists have trouble knowing how to talk to others.
Because if he's not God, how can we possibly explain his unprecedented claim?
He didn't make it because it's just a story? Or maybe at best he was just a crazy cult leader? Problem solved. I think my work's done here.
He certainly wasn't crazy, or joking, or lying. Let's consider 5 other explanations.
Oh, so we're going to do some kind of lunatic liar or Lord thing. Okay.
First, maybe Jesus was misunderstood. Perhaps he never really claimed to be God. But the historical evidence says otherwise.
How much do you want to bet the historical evidence is stories from the Bible?
Centuries before Jesus, God revealed himself to Abraham as the great I Am. So when Jesus said before Abraham was, I am, his Jewish audience knew full well that he was claiming to be equal to God. That's why they picked up stones to kill him. And when Jesus identified himself as the Son of Man, mentioned in Daniel's prophecy, the Jewish high court was well aware that he was claiming to be the pre-existent ruler and judge of the universe. As a result, they unanimously condemned him to death. No, Jesus wasn't misunderstood. To the Jews, his claim to be God was unmistakable.
So, yeah, Bible stories. Which means this is just an argument over what their stories say Jesus did. Kind of like Trekkies arguing over which maneuver Captain Calrissian made at the Battle of the Five Armies or whatever. And even there, the evidence is a little uneven. Jesus didn't exactly go around telling people he was God, which is why even apologists have to read between the lines of other things he said. And almost all the case for his divinity comes from the latest canonical gospel, John, which is the only gospel this "before Abraham was, I am" line is found in. As for the Son of Man thing, there's a lot of really complicated debate over what this phrase means and how Jesus was using it. That's way too much to get into here, but suffice it to say this video is cutting a lot of corners to get straight to simplified apologetic conclusions. And besides, it doesn't matter anyway because it's only a story.
But what about this? Maybe Jesus was a legend. In the first few centuries after the real Jesus lived, his followers invented the idea that Jesus was God. Is this valid? Was belief in the deity of Jesus added centuries later? Or did the very first Christians believe that Jesus was God?
Ooh. Listen carefully to the options they give you here. Either that the very first Christians believed, or that the belief was added centuries later. But why does it have to be centuries? Basically, they're trying to create a false dichotomy between the belief being developed centuries after the fact and the belief having always been there since the time of Christ. In doing so, they're trying to force us to choose between two extremes while hoping we don't notice a very sensible alternative somewhere in between, which is that the belief might have been developed within the first several decades, 100 years after Christ. And if we need to make it clearer what kind of stunt this video is trying to pull, look at where it divides the timeline. At the year 200 AD, meaning it's using the term the very first Christians to cover people who were writing about Jesus up to 170 years after the fact. And this is casting a very broad net. A contemporary of Jesus running straight home from the Ascension to write that Jesus is God is not the same as a monk writing the same in 150 AD. And this video is either purposely trying to obscure the difference or being inexcusably sloppy.
Again, the historical evidence speaks loud and clear. The earliest Christian writers made clear reference to Jesus who is our God, Jesus who is both God and man, Jesus who is not a mere man but was God. So the idea that Jesus of Nazareth is God was not invented after the Christian movement began, not at all. Christians always believed it from the very start.
Oh, so this is proof of what Christians always believed from the very start, huh? Well, let's actually check out some dates and see. Note: most of what we know about these men comes from their writings and from church tradition, so these approximate dates, as unhelpful as they already are to apologists once you look at them closely, are at best somewhat speculative. Ignatius, date of birth totally unknown, died sometime between 108 and 140 AD. Irenaeus, born between 120 and 140, died between 200 and 203. Clement, born 35 AD, died 99 AD. Justin Martyr, born 100 AD, died 165 AD. Paul of Tarsus. While he's largely understood by his portrayal as a character in Bible stories, and thus most clues about his life come from those stories, estimates place his birth around 5 AD and his death between 64 and 67 AD. Polycarp, born 65 AD, died 155 AD. So while I guess you could argue the semantics of whether these were among the earliest Christians, the fact is most of them were writing many years after the fact, at best going off second or third hand hearsay. Among them all, Paul was the closest, of course, but even he never met Jesus and wrote about him mostly as an abstraction with practically no mention of his earthly ministry, which is weird, and a lot of the writings attributed to him are known or at least suspected forgeries written by later church authors. But there's an even deeper problem, which is that this video is using these quotes to imply that Christianity started off with a unified understanding of Jesus' divinity. This couldn't be further from the truth. The earliest Christians held a wide array of ideas about Jesus, and this included questions of whether he was God and exactly what it would mean if he were. Some thought he had always been God, while others thought he was exalted to godhood at his death. Some thought he was the monotheistic God of Abraham, while others thought he was a new God come to challenge the evil or at least inferior God of the Old Testament. Some tried to reconcile the idea that he was more or less fully God and fully man, while others said his human form was only an illusion, and yet others that Jesus was nothing more than a normal man who was temporarily inhabited by the Christ, until it abandoned him right before the moment of death on the cross. And I've barely even scratched the surface of how diverse and to us unrecognizable the earliest Christianity actually was. These wildly diverging ideas of Jesus show us that the religion was built not on a unified memory of actual, well-documented events, but on an already chaotic, unreliable range of oral traditions, some of which would eventually win a series of bitter fights over the others to become Christianity as we know it today. So these carefully selected and suspiciously short quotes do not represent a unified idea of what Christians always believed from the start. It just looks that way when you cherry-pick them from among a lot of other authors. And by the way, appeals to what the New Testament says is of no help here, because the Gospels themselves were written and selected as this struggle was unfolding by people who were participating in it.
So, this explanation fails.
Does it, though? Because you really don't even address the core point of whether Jesus was legendary, at least not thoroughly. All you talked about is when Christians started calling him God. But it could have been that he was just one of many human cult leaders who got his followers to call him God, and then legends of everything from supernatural deeds to exaggerated virtue to the 100-0 record in arguments against the Pharisees and eventually resurrection were attached to him in the decades that followed. So people calling Jesus God has nothing to do with whether Jesus became legendary, or at least it doesn't debunk the possibility. In short, this video changed the subject, whiffed it on even that topic, and then dropped the mic by declaring, "This explanation fails." Great job, video.
But another way to try to make sense of Jesus' claim to be God is he was a clever political strategist. He falsely claimed to be God in the hope of focusing Jewish resistance against their Roman oppressors. However, in Jewish culture, claiming equality with God was not a good idea. In fact, it was a crime punishable by death. Jesus made it clear that he was not a political revolutionary, and the Roman government itself officially declared Jesus not guilty of inciting rebellion. So, this explanation doesn't work either.
Okay, here's the thing. There are all kinds of reasons Jesus might have pretended to be God. Maybe he thought claims of divinity would gain him more control over his followers. Maybe the cult of personality he was building got a little out of hand and the status was thrust upon him. Or maybe, as his following grew, he thought he could gain some regional influence within Judea. Only one possibility being that insinuating he was the Messiah, the Son of Man, or a similar figure would make him stand out among the other charismatic firebrand preachers and help him rally an ever-growing populist movement against the priestly elites. And maybe these terms verged on and grew into full-blown claims of divinity. Maybe he said a few things such as, "Give unto Caesar's what is Caesar's," both to avoid stirring up trouble with Rome, and to look like the more sensible alternative to hot-headed insurrectionist factions. The point is, the possibilities are endless. Yet this video just comes up with one oddly specific motivation, that claiming to be God would focus Jewish resistance against Rome, then quickly addresses that and moves on, as if it had just debunked every possible reason Jesus might have pretended to be God. It's a pretty obvious farce once you think about it. Also, I'm not sure the Jews under Roman occupation were allowed to execute people anyway, so they're really jumping to a lot of conclusions here.
But is it plausible that the historical Jesus never even existed? No. In addition to the eyewitness testimony of the 4 earliest biographers,
yeah, the Gospels weren't eyewitness testimony, and there's no credible reason to think they were. They were written between 66 and 110 AD by early church members who never claimed to be eyewitnesses, copy from each other word for word, and sometimes explicitly say they gathered information from other sources. Also, calling them biographers when they were writing theologically motivated works from within a religious tradition is a big stretch and makes exaggerated insinuations of objectivity and credibility.
Multiple Greek, Roman, and Jewish historians document the existence of Jesus, who is called Christ.
This is really playing fast and loose with language that implies historians were actually documenting the life of Jesus. Doing this would involve recording at least some specific details of him being certain places at certain times or doing certain things, piecing at least a few well-documented details into a partial timeline of his life and death. We have nothing like this outside the Gospels and other explicitly religious writings, which, let me emphasize, are the only places we find any detailed stories about the life of Jesus. Other than that, all we have are passing references to Jesus by people around 110 AD at the earliest, who tell us nothing about where they got the information and don't seem interested in doing so anyway because they're mainly just alluding to his name when talking about the rising Christian movement. I go into more detail about this in my video, The Weird Love Affair Between Christians and Josephus, but documentation of Jesus outside the Bible is meager to the point of being practically non-existent, regardless of what apologists try to imply.
In fact, there's as much documentary evidence for the existence of Jesus as there is for Julius Caesar.
No, there's not at all. Caesar's life is plentifully documented by varied contemporary authors, as well as by a complex, easily cross-referenced web of archaeological evidence, official documentation, and other day-to-day indications from the time of his life that leave no mistaking the fact that someone by his name existed and affected the course of Rome. Jesus has literally none of that, with everything about the figure arising decades to centuries after the fact, solely in the form of writing and usually religious documents promoting reverence to or worship of him. The fact that the church eventually gained control over the West and then made a lot of copies of these documents does not mean Jesus is as well attested as Caesar. If you feel like hearing me talk more about this, you can watch my earlier video, There's More Evidence for Jesus Than for Caesar.
That's why the vast majority of New Testament scholars affirm that Jesus was an actual living, breathing, historical figure.
Okay, so this is a worthless thing to say for one basic reason, which is that the vast majority of people who bother to specifically become New Testament scholars are almost certainly going to start off believing in Jesus anyway. That's like saying that the vast majority of Quranic scholars believe Allah is the one true God, or the vast majority of people who take photos of UFOs believe in aliens. So what does it prove that such an obviously self-selecting group says what we were expecting it to say? Now yeah, you'll find the occasional non-Christian in the bunch, but how much of the majority do they make up, and what does it mean if there was a real person or preacher behind the Jesus character anyway? Even I could see there being some real-life preacher somewhere down the line, but not only does that not prove any of the relevant assertions about him being God or having done miracles, but that person would probably be so different from the character in the stories that the connection is meaningless. Aaron Ra's video, Jesus Wasn't Jesus, is an excellent, easy-to-digest explanation of why this is the case. In short, to whatever extent this statement is superficially true, I don't care.
For those who examine the evidence objectively, all of these explanations fall short. But for the open-minded, there's at least one other option to consider. Perhaps Jesus was who he claimed to be. Unlike the other options, this explanation fits perfectly with the historical data. But it does have one major problem. It's not safe. Because if Jesus actually is God in human flesh, then ultimately your life is not your own, and true life can only be found in him.
Yeah. It's obvious to any open-minded person that Jesus was God, but people just don't want to face up to it because they'd have to change their lives and stop sinning and so on. The problem is this just isn't true, because the entire case made by this video, and pretty much any apologist who tries deducing Jesus was God, is obvious bald-faced rubbish that can be used to justify any non-evidence paranormal claim. It literally just involves listing what are proposed to be all the possible reasons for something, then striking some of them off for one reason or another, and deciding the one that's left must be the explanation. You know, the eliminate the impossible and no matter what's left, no matter how improbable, must be the truth nonsense that only works in formulaic fiction and basically amounts to an elaborate argument from ignorance. That light in the sky could only be weather, a human aircraft, or an alien spacecraft. And since it couldn't be the first two for XYZ reasons, then aliens must be visiting Earth. Jesus could only have been a legend or a pretender or actually God, and since he couldn't have been the first two for XYZ reasons, then he must have been God. This exercise fails at everything other than soothing the already convinced for two reasons. One, you can't know you've listed every theoretical explanation for the unknown phenomenon, and two, thoroughly eliminating possibilities is subject to conjecture and highly error-prone. Such is the case with this video's arguments for Jesus. It claims to present all the alternatives to Jesus being God, but we can't know it did this. And those it does bring up are addressed in a hurried fashion that tries to distract its audience with misdirection, and at best rush them through overly specific alternatives to Jesus' godhood, while ignoring multitudes of other options. And as long as these other, unaddressed options are still possible, apologetics like these do nothing to convince outsiders and only serve to make insiders feel better about the one conclusion they already wanted to believe from the start. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, The Crowd Pleaser, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.